So in a lot of ways, I'm going to talk tonight about ways to jump into the new endeavors that we dream about and think about and make them reality. Because I'm not using the R word. The R word, retirement, does not work for me at all. As far as I'm concerned, it's just the next phase of my life. And I've had 16 wonderful years here at UNH in the outdoor education program. And it's time. It's time to consider something else. Okay? And when I thought about this, I thought about one of the women that I worked with when I first left the journalism world and started to work for myself, doing contract work in the outdoors. This is my big push to turn my hobbies into jobs. And while I was teaching a women's only canoeing course at the Outdoor Center of New England, a great paddling center in western Massachusetts, I met a woman by the name of Marion Stoddard, who was 55 at the time that she came into this women's only workshop. She had been in an Outward Bound course, had loved it, but realized that she was in this course with 20-year-olds. And there had to be something for women her age that wanted to be outdoors but didn't really know how to go about doing it. And Marion and I worked together for a number of years. She asked me that day as she was starting her new business. At 55 years old, she was starting this new endeavor. And this business called Outdoor Vacations for Women Over 40. And could I come and help her get some programs off the ground from a professional point of view and help her train other women her age who would then take on leadership roles in this organization. So I was about 28 or 29 years old when I started working for her, so I didn't meet the cut for 40 years old. But ultimately, by the time I finished working with her, I think I did 1 or 2 trips when I'd hit 40, so we worked together for a long time. But she created this cadre of women who were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who helped her lead trips around the world. So I thought, here's this lovely evening tonight for all of you to come and tell stories about me. And I think what I need to do is I need to call Marion. And I had not talked with her in a number of years. So yesterday, I called her, okay? And we traded Christmas cards through the years, but I wanted to share with her how much I was profoundly affected by the stories that she told when she was first starting her business. And it wasn't so much about the outdoor stuff, but she won a United Nations award for activism on the part of cleaning up the Nashua River in Massachusetts. And she was a phenomenal environmentalist, starting in the 60s to help clean up some of the rivers in New England. I was curious, we really identified strongly with those passions because I grew up in a family that was always environmentally active, and it was important to be so. I loved the link that she had between that and then the outdoor programming. So in talking with her on the telephone yesterday, I said, so bring me up to date. What's going on in your life? And her voice is booming across the line. She's 89 years old. She stopped doing her last trip for outdoor vacations when she was 80. And the trip was a month-long expedition that she did in Southeast Asia. She took a bunch of women, essentially from, she said most of them were actually older. Not 40, but older than that. And she took them to Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. And they traveled for a month. And she figured at that point that that was a great trip to end on. She was going out on a high. And she continues to work to this day on behalf of environmental issues on the Nashua River. She has helped conserve 200 miles of land along the Nashua and all of its tributaries. And she is continuing to work on the next 200 miles. So she's 89 years old, she's going out to meetings, she's doing fundraising. She did amazing fundraising as an environmental activist, and she's transferring that to her passion, which is the Nashua River. Before she dies, she wants to make sure that there's at least 200 more miles of land that's conserved along this river. And what they're doing is they're building a whole series of trails that basically parallel the river, so that you can not only paddle it, but you can also hike it. And what was fascinating was that as a member of the Nashua River Watershed Council, she helped to create a classroom called the River Classroom. This past year, they put more than 3,000 kids from schools on the river in an environmental education program. And she's continued to do fundraising to support that kind of programming. So I'm talking to her on the telephone, and I'm totally psyched by the fact that she's still doing these kinds of things. And she said, so what are you planning on doing? And I'm like, I haven't got a real clear plan. In fact, Bruce and I are, we're not really good planners. We're opportunists. We've been opportunists all our lives, okay? Which is essentially how I ended up here at UNH, because Mike Gass called me on the telephone one day, and I said, why not? And what it did was it put me in contact with the brain trust of Mike Gass, Brent Bell, and Jason Seaman, and opened my world to a much wider world than I had been living in until that point. And it put me in touch with a whole crew of students that have continued through the years to be colorful, creative, curious, committed, and definitely not boring, which is why I've lasted for 16 years. And that still is the case, but it is time for me to move on to other things. And I'll get back to how I answered that question from Marion in a little bit. But I guess one of the things that I want to say is we all have phases in our life. We all have times when we need to go and we need to do something else. And I've had a recent conversation with one person in this room who needs to go do something else, and I totally understand. Self-employment for me was a wonderful thing, and the reason that it worked for me is because I put myself out there in really uncertain situations and talked to a whole variety of people. When I traveled around, I'd drop in and I'd visit people. I'm going to give you two examples, okay? One of them was in 1994, there was a group of us that were considering a combined trip in the Northwest Territories. Part of the team was going to paddle down the Nahanni River, and then we were going to hike overland and go into the Cirque of the Unclimbables, where we were going to meet our friends, the climbing team. Bruce was a part of that climbing team. And we had an uneven number, and I needed to get a solo boat. Out of the blue, I called this gentleman who'd been advertising in a paddling magazine, a Norwegian guy who had been advertising a new foldable canoe, so sort of a plastic skin over a aluminum frame. Identified myself. I had written one book at that point, the Red Book for the American Canoe Association. And he recognized my name. I asked if I could borrow this boat. I'd been doing boat testing for some different canoe companies, and he's like, no problem. Come meet me. We'll paddle the Muskoma River. We'll see if you like the boat, and I'll send you off with it. Which is kind of a dangerous thing to do, as the people in the most recent Adirondack trip know when you're doing product testing and things don't work out necessarily. But in this case, it worked out incredibly well. That began an association with Alf that has lasted to this day. He put me in touch with the Norwegian Tourist Board in New York City as a way for me to try to help fund a trip to Norway with him the first time when I went in '96. And on the strength of selling articles for different magazines, the Tourist Board funded my transportation into the country and up north of the Arctic Circle in Norway. I have never regretted stepping forward like that, not really knowing how it's going to turn out. I did that trip in the Nahanni. It led me to a 30-year association with Alf. And I say to students a lot of the time, call, step out, talk to people. And what's wonderful to see is the people who do it. Bobby Kerr is not here tonight, but I had a conversation with him after the Trump administration started to create all kinds of uncertainty around the budgets for the BLM and the Forest Service and the Park Service. And he wasn't sure whether or not his summer job was going to come through. And I said, in a NOLS course that I took last year, I met the head river ranger for the Deschutes River. You should call Jim and find out what's happening within the BLM, especially because you love paddling and he might have opportunities. You never know. Bobby Kerr's the kind of guy who gets on the telephone and does that and has a phone conversation. I was talking with Sam, and he was interested in citizen science and how he can become a part of scientific expeditions from a support point of view. He's reached out to people on campus. He may have a summer job from making the connections with some basic research, citizen support research projects that he can be a part of. All of that stuff, that's just the way that you make amazing headway and meet people who turn you on to more and more things. One of the things that happened to me on one of the trips in Norway was I was talking with the Norwegian Tourist Board, with Mr. Hansen from the Norwegian Tourist Board. And he says to me, well, I understand the theme of your features for these magazines, but I assume that you need to be writing some sidebars for these magazines. And I said, oh yeah, I do. And I'm thinking, okay, I got to do the mileage thing, and here's where you start, here's where you take out, and all of that simple stuff that goes on the side of the page. And he says to me, so how would you like to take part in a 5-day kayak tour in the Vesterålen Islands and do a little sidebar on the kayak tour? Oh yeah, that sounds lovely. I'd love to do that. I have no idea if I'm going to sell this, but why not? I'll try, okay? Okay, well, we can set you up for that. And are you a climber? Well, I'm kind of a climber. Would you like to do a climb in the Lofoten Islands and do a sidebar on that? Okay, why not? You know, that sounds great. Okay, so I go off. This is an example of be careful what you wish for, okay, and what you agreed to. Because after I did one of the canoeing expedition, which went just fine, I end up on the Vesterålen Islands with a major storm coming in off the North Cape. And the Norwegians do it differently than we do. For those of you who are used to our pod formation in the United States, where we try to have like nice intact groups, well managed, they put 75 people on the water with 5 leaders and no pods. So I am now in a boat I've never paddled in, with a left-hand control paddle, which is what the Norwegians use, unlike our right-hand control paddle. So I don't know if I have a brace. And I'm now going out into the biggest water I've ever been in. And I'm not as fast as the fast people, nor am I as slow as the slow people. And I end up in the middle by myself on the open ocean. And I've never been in this situation before. Thankfully, I was able to sort of form a group with other people who are basically looking at waves out there going, there's no way I'm going out there until we're a group together. And it was absolutely, ultimately a phenomenal experience, because one of the guys who was there with a group of people, a Norwegian guy, said, come with me. And he ended up bringing 7 or 8 of us along on this route that he had been on before. The second one, which was be careful what you wish for, was there's a climb in the Lofoten Islands called the Svalbardgoat. And what it is, it's a pinnacle of rock, very famous in Europe. It's a pinnacle of rock that ends up having 2 spires of rock, 2 pretty hard granite, although it is crumbling. And you don't start some of these climbs until you're 1,000 feet off the valley floor, off the island floor. So the exposure is wicked. And the climbs are only rated 5.6 to 5.9, but the exposure was unnerving. What you do at the top of the climb is you have to leap from one pinnacle to the other pinnacle, and the leap is about 5 feet, and it's about 3 feet down to the pinnacle. And the Swiss guide was absolutely tremendous. And basically he said to me, just know that what most people do is they go too hard, because they're nervous enough about it that they go a little too hard. So you don't really need to go all that hard. Just, step back and then take a couple steps and then leap, okay? And I'm looking down this way, and it's about, 1,500 feet, and I'm looking down this way, and it's much shorter than that, but still it's a leap. And you know me, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. And I took the leap, and I ended up ultimately doing a little running step once I landed on the other pinnacle, and I'm down on all fours, peering over the edge, and he's got me on the tightest belay I've ever been on. But I've always put myself in really uncomfortable situations as a means of developing empathy. And I think that it's one of the wisest things that we can do as instructors, is to always do something different, new, so that we understand the hinky feeling in the pit of our stomach that elevates our barometer just a little bit in terms of our actions. In that same vein, I have no idea how long I'm talking. I'm probably going to go farther than 10 minutes. I want to talk about hinky feelings for a little bit. Okay? I think we've all experienced those feelings where you're like, ooh, I don't know. Ooh. And in different situations, I've heeded those hinky feelings. We turned back on the Coppermine River in '99 because it was on flood, and we thought that it would be incredibly dangerous for some of the people that we were traveling with, and that we would exceed our food supply because of the volume of portaging and the degree of carefulness we would need to go downriver. This created enormous dissension in our group, especially from one member who did not want to turn back. Thought it was going to be the last trip of her life, and she didn't care if she died on the trip. And she said that, and you can imagine what that did within our group. That was a very challenging situation, but I think it was important to turn back. Bruce and I tried to do a solo trip in Labrador. Because people do solo trips. Why not? We've been paddling for a long time. Okay, it's our time. And we got hammered by a huge storm that knocked our nerve. And we decided that we did not want to go down the George River. And we still have a date on the George River in the future, maybe with Johnson, because it is one of the trips that's on the bucket list. Because we turned back from that, and that's probably a really wise thing that we did at that time. Because whenever people in the party lose their nerve, I tried to talk Bruce into doing it. And he's like, because I had a lot of ego involved in that, how can I go home and say that I turned back on the George River when so many people we know have gone down it? And he's like, I can't do it. I just can't do it. It just doesn't feel right. And when your partner says it just doesn't feel right, you have to listen. You really have to listen. Again, one of the best things we ever did, not just for our lives, but probably our relationship. Yeah. The other thing that I've done a couple of times is that a number of you went on Pam's trip in Arizona and would come home and talk about that and talk about it in glowing terms, but also have a hard time putting it into words. And I've been listening to that for a number of years, and I finally said, I've got to do this trip. I have got to do this trip, which is how Kim and I ended up on it. And it's also the last time that I was able to travel with Paul Smith. And it was an opportunity for me to see Pam and Paul together. And something told me to go on that trip, and I'm so glad that I did. Because there are times when we shouldn't put things off. We really shouldn't. Yep. In that same vein, I had an opportunity to visit the Cree in northern Quebec with Deb Williams, who works at the Hubbard Outdoor Center. And she'd been traveling up there for 20 years and had established an incredible relationship with some of the families in the Ojibwe community. And I'd been talking with her for years about doing that trip. And I finally decided that I was going to do it. It was the last, I signed on to the last year that she ever led that trip before she encountered some health problems. And I'm so glad that I didn't put that off. I didn't put that off. So that gets back to why I'm not putting off leaving and moving on. Because there are moments in your life, I think, when it's time to take those steps, to take the big leap, not really knowing what might be on the other side. So what's the plan? What's the plan? Well, one of the things, yikes. Yeah. One of the things that Marion said to me on the telephone yesterday was, Laurie, you have more energy than a lot of people I know. So I think what you're planning on doing is absolutely wonderful. And what I did was I had this stream of consciousness on the telephone with her. And I was talking with her about the fact that I have really appreciated the conservation easement work that I've done for one of the local land trusts just west of here. And Bruce and I belong now to a land trust up in Vermont that we've been members of for a number of years. And I want to do easement monitoring up there. There also is a big push in the Northeast Kingdom in Vermont to do more work with the rivers in terms of creating accessibility for people in the local communities and working with landowners in order to improve access and campsites and that sort of thing. And I've wanted to be up there and be a part of that group, which I plan on doing. But mostly what I'm going to do is go out west, spend time in Vermont with people I love, spend time with family, work part-time. If I have to teach skiing in Yosemite, a lot of you have heard me say, well, that I have to teach skiing in Yosemite in the wintertime. I'm going to be contacting Sean's cousin, Greg Coet, to ask him how I go about getting that job in Yosemite, because he's got it, and I want it. And at one point, Mike said to me, when I first said that I was going to move on, Mike's like, well, what are you going to do? And I think the overarching umbrella, and this is where I started in the outdoor field, I started getting kids outdoors and getting women outdoors and basically working with families outdoors. And that's ultimately what I want to do, because I think that it is so important right now to get kids and their families outdoors. It is so important for the health of our communities and for the health of our families that I'm just going to do that. Will I be back? Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll be back. I'll be back to visit. I'll be back to see people at graduation, because some of my advisees are graduating in another year from now, not this year. And UNH will always have an incredibly special place in my heart for the people that are in the room tonight. I mentioned the three-person brain trust. But one of my regrets, and I don't often have regrets in life, but one of my regrets is not spending more time down at the Brown Center, without a doubt. We're so siloed sometimes at UNH that it's challenging to do that. But I am so glad that I did the time in Arizona in order to make stronger connections with UPM. And I also want to recognize one of the people that I spend my day with. And he's brought joy into my life on a daily basis, and that's Nate Fitch. Because we have one heck of a good time bouncing ideas off each other's heads. And that's what I will miss greatly. So thank you all. Thank you all for your thoughts tonight. Keep the ripple effect going.